On March 18th, 1990, the most audacious art heist of all time took place at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Two men dressed as police officers were admitted into the building by security, claiming to be responding to a disturbance call.
In 81 minutes, 13 pieces of art were stolen. Among the portraits, stripped from their frames, were works by Vermeer, Degas, and Rembrandt. Estimated at $500 million, the heist has been categorized as the largest and most frustrating of all time. Theories of their whereabouts and those who perpetrated the crime are abundant.
In this podcast series, we will dig as deep as possible into the case, the theories, and the social and economic impact the greatest unsolved art heist of all time had on the community. This is Empty Frames. Welcome back to Empty Frames. I am Tim, here today again with Lance. Lance, big interview today. How's it going?
It's going great. I always love hearing those words. Welcome back to Empty Frames, because every time that we release an episode on this channel, it's when we have some sort of breaking information about the 13 stolen pieces of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. We are right here, coincidentally, at the anniversary as we hover around St. Patrick's Day here in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's great that we have this gentleman on who is probably the most insider of insiders when it comes to the investigation. I was delighted that he agreed to come on the show. His book's fantastic. Yeah, love this interview.
Yeah, same. Yeah, Geoff Kelly has written a new book. It's called 13 Perfect Fugitives, the true story of the mob murder and the world's largest art heist. And Geoffrey Kelly, Lance, was the lead investigator at the FBI on the Gardner case for about 2 decades. And so it's incredible to finally get to speak with someone so knowledgeable in the heist as Geoff Kelly. He knows the answers behind the gate, Lance. Everyone we've spoken to on this show previously is talking about the case from the outside of the gate. This is the first time that we've spoken with someone on the inside like this. And his book makes you feel like you're right there alongside him as well. His book is incredible, and there are a lot of revelations in this book. So we urge you to pick yourself up a copy. It is definitely one of the best true crime books I've ever read. I find this topic to be fascinating, and certainly if you read this book, I think you'll agree.
Dare I say this is maybe the definitive book on the art heist, and right up there for the definitive interview that we've had on Empty Frames. We've had a bunch of really great interviews, but we haven't had anyone on who has been directly, like you said, like on the other side.
Yeah, I think if we were ever so inclined to end this show, I think this would be actually the most appropriate time to end this feed. I don't want to do that. There's plenty to continue reporting on. And I'd also love to speak with Geoffrey Kelly again, because I do think there is more meat on the bone as far as his book. And, just don't want to spoil everything for our audience who hasn't read the book yet. But maybe once more people have read it, we'll have him back on to get a little bit deeper, because there's just so much there.
Yes, and I know that there are probably some former guests that we've had on the show who heard that, and they were like, don't end the feed until I get on and give you my breaking information, which we will have as well. So rest assured, the feed is not going to end, but it was a hypothetical. Also, We've been emailing with Geoffrey Kelly about the other successes that he's had during his career in the stolen art division of the FBI. And he has at least 2 that he wants to come back on to talk about. One of them is so unique and amazing and very familiar to folks here in the New England region. So we can't wait to get him back on, A, to talk about more Gardner stuff, but B, to talk about his other successes while he's championed many successful art recovery investigations.
Absolutely. So I look forward to speaking with him again. And Lance and I will also do a debrief from this conversation because, again, there's a lot here. There's some breaking information as far as this podcast feed goes and what we've previously reported here. We've got some definitive answers on a few things. So we want to do a separate conversation, and we'll probably bring that to this feed, I would say, next week. So look for that as well. And thank you very much for listening. And also, just want to let our audience know we do regular shows under the banner Crawlspace and Missing, 2 separate shows that we produce weekly here at Crawlspace Media. You can check those out if you want more Tim and Lance.
And before we get to this interview, we just want to mention that we are having a live show. This is an in-person live show, not a virtual live show. We made some new friends, the fine ladies behind the show, Another Effing Horror Podcast, Monique and Amy. And we decided that it would be fun to get together and approach a live show focused on a comical element of true crime. We're going to be searching for the world's dumbest criminals. So a fun take on true crime. And that is Saturday, April 25th in Astoria, New York, which is in the Queens neighborhood, a very fine part of New York. The link for tickets, that's in the show notes. So we hope to see as many folks there as possible.
Okay, please let us know what you think on YouTube or Spotify. We're going to break quick here for commercial, and we'll be right back with the one and only Geoffrey Kelly. Welcome to the podcast, Geoffrey Kelly. Geoff, how are you today?
I'm good, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, so you're a guest that we've been really wanting to have on for a while because we've covered the Gardner heist a lot, and we're very invested in it, and you are one of the best experts that we could have asked to have on, and I think timing just all kind of works out really well because you have this new book that's absolutely amazing. And I think Tim had said to me yesterday, he was like, this might be the definitive Gardner book. And there have been a lot of Gardner books. And after reading it, it's sort of like, yeah, there's not a whole lot that I can figure out can be told in addition to what you've just done. But anyway, can you fill our listeners in before I go on too long with this? Can you fill our listeners in on who you are?
Yeah, so I retired from the FBI almost 2 years ago now. Time flies. But after almost 29 years of service, I was one of the original members on the FBI's art crime team, which was formed in 2004. And I started working the Gardner heist investigation in 2002, which is kind of what got me interested in art theft in the first place. And I worked that case right up until the day I retired. So that's 22 years of working the same investigation. I worked it for a long time. It followed me around through squad changes and different supervisors, but it was this enduring case that I maintained throughout my career. And in doing that, it's kind of a little bit of inside baseball, right? I mean, I have the FBI's internal investigation into the Gardner heist, and as a result, I have a lot of information that was never available to the public. And so there have been a number of books and documentaries written about the heist, some better than others. And a lot of authors had to rely on their best guess or supposition as to what happened or what was the FBI thinking. And so I was able to write this book and actually put it out there and dispel a lot of these myths and these specious theories. And really what I hoped was to tell a definitive story and without trying to sound too, vaunted, I'm not. I feel like there's an obligation and a responsibility. This is the world's largest art heist. It's been pending for almost 36 years, and I think the public deserves to have the full, complete story of this is what happened. And really, at this point, it's a treasure hunt, right? We're trying to find the paintings. It's not a question of putting people in jail who did the robbery. We're trying to recover the paintings. And so the more help that we can get, the better and the better chance for success.
You said that you were investigating this along with other cases for the past 22 years. And we've had people on, and this isn't our particular feelings, but we've had people who we've spoken with who've said, they've been investigating this since 1990, and it's just one failure after another. And I think your book kind of explains, like, it's not like everybody was just sitting on their hands and just waiting for these things to show up. What do you say to people when they ask you, what have you been doing for 22 years for this? Like, why is it taking so long? Because I think it's a ridiculous question.
Yeah, no, listen, it's a fair question, right? And, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to take it to, like, boil it down to its essential elements, I'm going to take 13 items. 2 are large, 4 feet by 5 feet, but they're only about 1/4 of an inch thick when stacked together. And the other 11 items will fit in a Rubbermaid container. And I'm going to hide them somewhere on Earth. And you've got to find them. Go. Right? That's really what it's like. It's a scavenger hunt when the entire planet Earth is in play. And it's difficult. And you're trying to deal with a case. I got the case in 2002. By the time I got it, it had already been, it was 12 years old. And that's difficult. No FBI agent wants to inherit a cold case. You want to take a case from the beginning. And it was kind of stagnant and moribund at that point. And I really tried to invigorate it and look at it with a fresh set of eyes. And so we made tremendous advancements in this case, and we identified who we believe was responsible for it. And we had sightings of the artwork, some of the pieces at various points along the way in different states. So, there was a lot going on. I was working really hard. We had informants and undercover operations, and we were buying drugs and guns and executing search warrants. So we were really very busy. And yeah, to be honest with you, when I'd hear these things in the news about how the FBI wasn't doing anything, was just kind of sitting around waiting for somebody to return the paintings, it's aggravating, and I made a point of putting a little anecdote in my book about how 2014, when we were doing this undercover operation, and I was running 2 informants into this subject down in Connecticut, and my family couldn't even get a weekend away to go to the beach for the weekend. Like, that's how busy I was on this case. For an entire summer, I didn't have 2 days off in a row to just go take the kids away. And I wanted to put that in there because it really kind of illustrates what you're saying. Like, for anybody who thinks that we were just sitting around doing nothing, it's a difficult case. And we made some good achievements on it. But yeah, at the end of the day, we haven't recovered the paintings, but the quest continues.
There are a lot of shocking moments, I will say, in reading the book, because there are aspects of this case that we know very well, like the price list, just a random example. And then you present who actually wrote the price list in the book. And that is very interesting stuff to me. But can you take us back to the night of the heist and just give us a quick overview of how it went down?
Sure. So it was very early. It was just after midnight on March 18th, 1990. So St. Patrick's Day had just wound down. They're still going on in Boston. For those of you who aren't from Massachusetts, Boston is known for its St. Patrick's Day parties. And I think it was by design, because obviously the police were going to be distracted elsewhere. The 2 night guards clocked on for duty. And at 1:24 in the morning, the buzzer rings at the service door on Palace Road at the museum. And the guard asks who it is, and there's purportedly 2 Boston cops, and they say they're responding to a disturbance. And so the guard, against protocol, buzzes them into what's known as a man trap, which is like a little anteroom. And then once that door closes, he buzzes them into the guard area. Once they come in, they ask him who else is working. This is the guard, Rick Abbott. He tells them that his partner, Randy, is upstairs. They instruct him to get Randy down. So Rick calls him over the radio. Once the 2 of them are there, the police officers, I'm not a fan of air quotes, but this would be the time to use it, right? But they instruct Rick to come away from behind the watch desk, which is where there's a panic button that, if pressed, will contact the real police. Once they have him out from around the desk, they say, hey, there's a warrant for your arrest. They tell him to assume the position. Rick goes spread eagle against the wall, as does his partner. They're handcuffed, and once they're in handcuffs, our subjects say, gentlemen, this is a robbery. So they take them down, lock them up in the basement, and then they spend the next 81 minutes going through the museum, removing 13 objects. Some of them are of incredible value and historical importance. You have the concert by Vermeer, which is one of only 36 Vermeers in the world. You have Rembrandt's only known seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. Some other pieces that really aren't quite so valuable, that are a little bit enigmatic, like some very basic sketches by Degas. And after they load it all up, they leave the museum at 2:45 a.m. And in 81 minutes, they just pulled off the world's largest art heist.
The world's largest art heist, and you have written a new book on it, and you worked on the case, and it's still an open investigation, right?
Yeah.
How much of what you put in the book did you have to run by any superiors, or what was your vetting process on what information made the book and what shouldn't be in the book?
So the only thing I had to run by the FBI was everything from the cover page to the back page.
Oh, that's it? Okay, good.
Yeah, listen, my good friend and colleague Anthony Amori, who's the director of security at the Gardner Museum, we worked this case together for nearly 20 years. And he was always saying to me once I retired, you got to write a book about this. It's such a fascinating case, even though, and I would always say, hey, but it's missing the last chapter. And he would counter that by saying there's so much that's gone on in this case, and it's so interesting. That's almost secondary to the investigation. So finally, almost to be like, to shut him up, I'm like, all right, look, I'll send a proposal to the FBI, but I can tell you that they're most likely going to come back and say no, because it's a pending investigation. And I argued. I argued persuasively by saying, listen, this has always been an unusual case. It's not the typical FBI pending case. We've been very upfront with publicity. We've done billboard campaigns and public service videos and media, getting the word out to the media. So we've done so much that I thought they might understand that a book like this would be helpful. And they did. And the FBI came back and said, absolutely. You can write this. And so, of course, once I wrote it, I had to send it back down to have them go through it to make sure there wasn't anything that was inappropriate or sensitive. And there were very few changes that needed to be made, just a couple of minor things that, changing last names and things like that. But otherwise, the book as written was allowed to be published, which I've always, the FBI gets a bad rap, but I worked there for 29 years. It was a tremendous organization. It's still a tremendous organization. And to their credit, they understood the importance of this case, not only through the last 36 years, but in writing about it and getting the word out. And look, I'm hopeful that people read this book and maybe something's going to resonate with somebody, and it might even lead to a recovery. But it's definitely something that needs to be out there.
And there are so many, smaller mysteries inside this larger story. And the first one that I think that you kind of tackle in the book is the idea of a possible inside source who worked at the museum. Can you tell us about Rick, and what is the best evidence, in your opinion, that he was that inside source?
Yeah, look, I've spoken to Rick so many times over the years, and it was always very cordial, but it was never very productive. Rick's, despite all the evidence, and there was a huge amount of evidence pointing towards Rick's involvement, his attitude was, it's like a country western song, like, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. And sometimes it's a good legal defense, I guess. And that was always his argument was, look, I know it looks really bad, but I wasn't involved. And the fact is that he had to be involved, that there's no way that he wasn't complicit in the heist. I don't, for a second, think that he was the mastermind or that he was part of this crew. But when those subjects showed up at the museum that night, they knew that they were going to get in. And really the biggest thing that points to his involvement is the motion sensor data. To go back to 1990, throughout the museum, they had motion sensors. And if you went into a particular gallery or a hallway or whatever, that motion sensor would trigger the fact that you were there, and it would send a message back to a computer screen saying that somebody was in this particular gallery or this hallway or whatnot, and it would spit out on one of these dot matrix printers that somebody has gone into this gallery. And we know that Rick, when he was supposed to be manning the watch desk, and his partner was up doing his rounds, we know that Rick inexplicably left the watch desk, went to a gallery, the Blue Room Gallery, which he just visited 20 minutes before, went into the gallery, and then shortly left. Shortly thereafter, he left. And that data was recorded on the motion sensors, which the subjects took with them. And it was always like a surprising thing, because really there's no reason why these guys would need to take the motion sensors, right? Because the data that's on the printout, because the investigators are going to know what rooms they went into. They're going to know from the empty frames. So who cares if the FBI knows the order in which they went to the galleries? But I think Rick would care very much, because it turns out that all that data was stored on the hard drive of the computer, so it didn't need the printout. And it showed that the subjects, during the entire time, the 81 minutes that they were in the museum, they never went anywhere near the Blue Room Gallery. They were never in the Blue Room Gallery. They made a beeline up to the second floor, back down, and then they left. So the only human being who was in the Blue Room Gallery that night was Rick Abbott. And so therefore, Rick Abbott had to have taken Shea Tortoni off the wall of the museum when he was in there at 12:53, 31 minutes before the robbery started. So it's pretty incriminating.
Now, we mentioned his partner there, Randy. He was the other security guard that was there that night. I have two questions here that kind of go hand in hand. If Rick was in on it, how far back did that relationship go with the people who robbed the museum? Was it like a couple of days, a week, according to your investigation? And was Randy in on it too?
No, Randy was not in on it. Randy was a last-minute fill-in. He was filling in for somebody that had called in sick. So yeah, Randy had nothing to do with it. And as far as any relationship, we've never been able to conclusively determine what relationship Rick may have had with these guys. Rick, by his own admission, and this is information that he's put out there to the Boston Globe and other media outlets, would use recreational drugs, cocaine and marijuana. And so the subjects that we believe were responsible for the heist were involved in drug trafficking. And is there a possibility that their paths overlapped at some point? There's a definite possibility of that. But it's important to understand when we're talking about Rick's complicity in the heist. I want to stress that we're not saying that he was part of the crew. It really was just, he'd just given his notice. He was less than 2 weeks away from being done with the Gardner Museum. And really all it was, I think, was somebody saying, hey, there's going to be the cops are going to show up at the museum. All you need to do is press the buzzer and let them in.
Now, the thieves intended to steal another Rembrandt that evening. It is written about in your book. This is the first time I believe I've heard this, and this was pretty interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about that other painting that I guess it never actually was removed from the museum? And then also, is the fact that I guess it was 3 Rembrandts that were targeted, is that a clue to identify the thieves in any way?
Not as much to identify the thieves as to identify maybe the geographic area. So if you look historically in Massachusetts, there have been a number of museum robberies of note, right? We had the first armed robbery of a museum in the United States occurred in 1972 or 1973 when the Worcester Art Museum was robbed. And one of the 4 pieces that was taken was a Rembrandt St. Bartholomew. In 1975, Miles Connor, who is a notorious and prolific art thief in Massachusetts, truly a phenomenal art thief, and in order to get out of jail, kind of get out of jail free card, he went and did a smash and grab of a Rembrandt from the Museum of Fine Arts, the MFA, just across the street from the Gardner. And so Massachusetts thieves seem to gravitate towards this. And when you think of Rembrandt, I always like to say that it's kind of like the Ferrari of sports cars. They're so well known. You don't have to be an art lover. You don't have to be an art expert or a connoisseur to know that Rembrandt is valuable. And I think that the robbery, the basis for the robbery was kind of a get out of jail free card. They could take these Rembrandts, use them, negotiate for any future criminal activity. Maybe they could negotiate some type of reward. I'm not going to say a ransom, because museums don't pay ransoms. But to me, it's no accident that when they went into the museum proper, they made a beeline for the Dutch room, which is where all things Rembrandt are, and it's also where a lot of really fine Dutch masters are, Holbeins and Dürer, but they went for the Rembrandts. They went for the ones that you would think about when you're thinking about high-end art. And so, you have Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, Lady and Gentleman in Black. You have a very small self-portrait etching. You have a piece by Govard Flink called Landscape with an Obelisk, which up until the mid-'80s was misattributed to Rembrandt. Meaning that if you did any research on just slightly outdated materials, you would believe that that was actually a Rembrandt. It was actually Govard Flink was one of his pupils. So that's 3, possibly 4. And then the last one that you just mentioned, it's a large oil on panel Rembrandt self-portrait age 23. And that one was found the next morning off the wall with the verso, the back facing out, leaning up against a dark piece of furniture. And because it's an oil on panel, the back of it is dark wood. And we believe that it probably just blended in at night, and they just forgot to grab it. And so the plethora of Rembrandts would lead you to think that these guys were going on a Rembrandt shopping spree. And the Vermeer, I don't know if it was serendipity that they ended up taking the concert by Vermeer also in that room right next to, it was kind of butted up against the Flink, arguably the world's most valuable piece of stolen artwork today.
Now, I'd love to go back to Rick Abbott for 1 second, because while you're answering that, this question occurred to me. You were talking about Rick Abbott and how this could have been something where the individuals spoke to him and said, hey, the police are going to show up, just buzz them in. So if that's the case and he buzzes them in and then he realizes that these are in fact not police, or maybe they're corrupt police, in the moment he might not realize exactly who they are, but they've identified themselves as authority, how would they have known, and what would they have had to have done to make sure that he didn't go to the police afterward to say, yeah, these 2 guys approached me a few nights ago and said, just let the police in. And on that, why wouldn't he have told the police that when the police actually questioned him, or told you that?
Yeah, no, so I need to be clear on that, Lance. I'm sorry, when I said that there's going to be the police buzz the cops in, I'm saying he knew that it was going to be a robbery. He knew that they weren't real cops. It was just a question of he would therefore have plausible deniability by saying that he thought that they were real cops. And it's important, and one of the things that I think really points to Rick's involvement in this comes back to the point about buzzing in the cops. If you're going to pull off a big museum score, right, and you've done your homework and you have a good idea, like they were in that museum for 81 minutes, that is absolutely unheard of in the annals of art theft. Nobody stays in a museum that long. They had a comfort level in there. They knew that there were no dead man switches. They knew that the guards didn't need to call in somewhere. They knew that when the proximity alarms near some of the paintings were only alerting internally. So they knew where the security tapes were kept. They had all this information. So they'd obviously done their homework. And so if you're going to go to a museum dressed as police officers and your plan is we're going to press the doorbell and they're going to let us in, I think it stands to reason that you would have wanted to know, well, what is protocol? What are the police going to do what is the guard going to do if the police show up? And it was really clear cut what they were supposed to do. They were guards were instructed, it was written into the security manual, that they were not to let police officers in unless they'd summoned them. They were supposed to call the local police district and get their names and badges and verify that they were the real cops. And in fact, Rick's direct supervisor specifically recalled telling Rick when he was training him that, hey, this is your chance to keep the cops out, because he described Rick as being very anti-police. And he said, this is your opportunity to tell the cops you're going to have to wait outside, which he recalled Rick like that. So Rick knew the policy, and our subjects knew the policy, and I find it hard to believe that anybody would go rob a museum and press that doorbell when you know that protocol is they're going to call the cops, in which case you're going to get arrested standing there in police uniforms.
Right. And just if we're theorizing here, what was the incentive for Rick to not give these guys up? What was his reassurance to the individuals? What did they provide him? What was that? Why was that relationship so good that he never turned on them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there'd be an intimidation factor. These guys were not to be trifled with, but there was also a reward for Rick, in my opinion. This didn't come out until many years later during my tenure on the investigation, but we found out for the first time, and I think it was 2012, when Rick casually admitted to us that he found a pound of marijuana shortly after the robbery occurred. And that's a pretty big incentive. It's very difficult. Typically, people don't find a pound of marijuana. And doing some additional research, I spoke to his ex-wife, and she confirmed that shortly after the heist, Rick told her that he came home one day and there was a brown paper package tied up with string on the front porch of his house, addressed to him, and it contained a pound of weed. And so, that would seem to be a pretty fair trade for everything that Rick went through.
Right. And they had taken his license. So I guess they had one of his addresses. I don't know if it was that one, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a very not very discreet threat when you take the victim's driver's license, and they did it for both Rick and for Randy. So it would be an incentive to keep your mouth shut.
Now, we mentioned Miles Connor a few moments ago, and in his book, he talks about casing the Gardner Museum with Bobby Donati. However, Miles Connor was incarcerated at the time of the Gardner heist. So Miles it seems like he always thought Bobby Donati pulled the heist because the heist was essentially done based on the way that they cased it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's very correct. And it's, when you first look at the items that were taken, and it's kind of an eclectic collection of items that were taken, some Degas sketches, and there was what's called a Chinese goo. It's like a beaker, and the finial, which is a gilded bronze eagle that sits atop a Napoleonic flag. These things are kind of disparate, and you wonder what's the connection. But it really is pretty obvious when you talk to Miles about it, because he's confident that Bobby Donati pulled off the heist because they cased it together. And at the time when they cased it, Donati told Miles that he was going to take the finial. He said he's going to take the finial, and that's going to be his calling card. He's going to say the eagle has landed. And in fact, 6 weeks after the heist, a jeweler in the jewelry district claims that Bobby Donati walked into his shop one day and unwrapped the finial. And he said, "What's this thing worth?" And the jeweler, whom I interviewed in 2015, told him it's worth nothing. It's way too hot, because he immediately recognized it as one of the pieces that had been stolen from the Gardner Museum. So, I mean, that's a pretty credible and compelling piece of evidence that not only links Bobby Donati to the crime, but I put it in the column of sightings of the stolen pieces subsequent to March 18th of 1990.
And Miles Connor is still alive and well today, I believe, and Bobby Donati is as well, right? I'm just kidding.
Oh yeah, no, Bobby Donati was brutally murdered in September of 91, year and a half after the heist, and the police report said that it appeared that he was murdered on his front porch. And it appeared from the police report that somebody had broken into the house and had rifled through it looking for something, which, I think from what I laid out in the book is I think they were looking for pieces from the Gardner Museum.
Now, why was it getting that hot? In the world of art crime, you don't really associate that type of violence with this type of crime. I mean, there is violence with this type of crime, of course, but now it feels like it's getting personal.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, when we talk about art crime, everybody immediately calls to mind like Ocean's 11 or the Thomas Crown affair and Catherine Zeta-Jones, coming in through a skylight, rappelling in. And unfortunately, that's just not the reality. The reality is that it's typically committed by robbers with lengthy criminal histories. And that's what happened in this case, in my opinion, and in the FBI's opinion, that it was committed by a group of very serious career felons. And the idea of talking about it can have dire implications. I always bring up the analogy of Goodfellas, right? The Lufthansa heist that occurred in, I think it was 1975, right, at JFK Airport. That was a real heist that occurred, and it drew way too much attention from the FBI. And over the ensuing year, 9 members of the crime family were brutally murdered. And so I think there's the potential that this is what happened here, that there were 3 murders and 1 very suspicious death that occurred from individuals who were associated with the robbery. That all happened within a year and a half of the crime occurring. And it's going to have a chilling effect on anybody who harbored any illusions about going to the FBI and cooperating. I think it has a chilling effect on that.
Super interesting. You mentioned the Lufthansa heist. As of right now, which heist actually has a higher monetary number to it?
Oh, it's definitely the Gardner. I think the Lufthansa heist is like $5 million or something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're talking, probably now it's so difficult to even come up with a figure, but you're probably talking $1 billion at this point. If these pieces were found and they were actually, for whatever reason, monetized, which they wouldn't be, but if they were to find their way onto the legitimate art market where they could be sold with a clean title, they would go for well over $1 billion. They're just too famous.
Yeah. And so how much were they when Bobby Donati was murdered?
Maybe 200 million.
$200 million. Like, I feel like this is important to really dig into for 30 seconds. You mentioned the Lufthansa heist, and that's, $3 or $4 million. And then when Bobby Donati was murdered. So yeah, if you're talking about career criminals with vendettas and aspirations that might not be on the up and up, that's a lot of motivation.
It's 200 million reasons to kill somebody who you think might dime you out. And of course, it's also important to understand, Lance, that when we're talking, like the art crime team, which I was one of the founding members, we've recovered like over $1 billion, right, in stolen art and cultural property. And it's so difficult. It sounds so crass when you put a dollar figure on it, because it's so much more than that. But at the end of the day, from a criminal investigator standpoint, when you're talking about art theft, you do have to affix a value. And there's 2 very important reasons for doing that. One is, in order for the FBI to have venue to investigate it, it has to travel interstate and be worth at least $5,000, which this easily clears that threshold. But if you are successful in arresting and prosecuting somebody for these crimes, there's a federal sentencing guideline, which is kind of like a matrix that's used to determine how much time somebody is going to spend in prison. And for financial crimes and for property crimes, it is directly proportional to the value of the piece. So even though nobody got hurt in the Gardner Museum heist and nobody saw any weapons even displayed in the Gardner Museum heist, at the time, the theft of $200 million in property under the federal sentencing guidelines would be virtually a life sentence for anybody that's convicted of that. That's a tremendous incentive to keep people quiet.
But it appears that no one ever sold the paintings or actually benefited financially. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, and you're correct, and that's one of the the bitter ironies of stealing high-end artwork. You know, you have criminals who are so intrigued by it, you know, because you're getting pennies on the dollar, but even pennies on the dollar for $200 million in property is still a pretty good haul. But you realize you can't even get that. These pieces are too recognizable. And one other aspect about the Gardner Museum, which is different from most museums, is the collection was not insured for theft. I mean, there's not. I'm not talking when it's being lent out or when it's in transit, but as far as the collection is concerned, it's not insured. And you know, invariably people gasp when they hear that, like, how could that not be? How could that be the case? But when you think about it, Mrs. Gardner had a very unique stipulation in her will when she died, and she said that nothing that's in the collection can be removed and nothing can be added to the collection. In fact, this painting here can't move to that wall. You know, this is how specific it was. And if that does happen, then the entire collection is going to be sold off and the proceeds given to Harvard. So when you have that kind of provision in the will that governs the operation of your museum, if you can't replace things that are stolen, there's really no reason to have insurance for it. And that's a fact that I don't think would have been known by anybody at the time. I mean, anybody who follows the Gardner heist knows about it now, but you know, prior to 1990, you know, you think you're going to negotiate a return through an insurance company and whatnot, and then you find out that there was no insurance on it. That also makes it very difficult to negotiate a return for the stolen pieces.
Can you tell us how the Corsican mob is somehow in the discussion?
Yeah, 2 words. They're not. They were not. So in 2006, the French National Police, their art crime team, the OCBC, outstanding team, and they came to us and said that they had some Corsican organized crime subjects who were claiming that they had access to some very valuable paintings that were stolen in Boston in the 1990s, a Vermeer and a Rembrandt. Well, obviously, you know, process of elimination, that could only be the Gardner paintings. And it didn't seem viable, you know, like if from kind of passing like the smell test, like I don't get it. Why would the Corsicans come all the way to Boston to pull off this heist? And you know, the answer was, well, Napoleon was from Corsica, and the finial from the flag was from a Napoleonic flag. And I'm like, well, that's pretty tenuous. I mean, to pull off an international art heist in a country that doesn't have a large Corsican, you know, community, and the subjects were not French, you know, it seemed to go to all that trouble just to steal the top off a flagpole seemed pretty specious. But there was no question that these guys were talking about it. And so we commenced an undercover operation that went on for 1.5 years. It was this international operation. It was in Paris and Miami, and expended a tremendous amount of time and resources on this. And at the end of the day, you know, after 1 year, this thing's going on, and Bob Whitman, who's the kind of the patriarch of the art crime team, he was my undercover who was brought in for this. And I'm pushing Bob to push the Corsican contact in Miami. Hey, we need proof of life. We need to see that these guys really have the paintings they're saying. And let's even back it up. They haven't even told us what they have. They just said they have a Rembrandt and a Vermeer. Well, we know the Vermeer, if they have it, it would be the concert, but there were 3 Rembrandts that were taken. So this goes on, and I'm pressing Bob to press them. Like, we need to if you have these paintings, we want to know what you have. We want to see, like, take some Polaroids of the backs so we can see. And it was never forthcoming. And after about 1 year of this stalling, you know, and Bob, we introduced the Miami subject. We introduced them to the potential buyers through Bob, and they were these South American, you know, drug cartel, and they wanted the paintings, right? And there's a reason they want the paintings. The legend was these drug traffickers. They want to have the world's most valuable stolen paintings on the walls of their mansion down in South America. So it was a believable, credible legend. Well, they wouldn't produce any proof of life, and we started pushing them. And Bob was telling them, "Look, my buyers are getting cold feet. They'd taken $30 million because that was supposedly what they wanted for the pieces, and they put it in an account for you, which we showed proof of, and they want to do the deal." And so when kind of push came to shove, instead they went out. The subjects went and committed an armed robbery of the Museum of Fine Arts in Nice, France. And now they said to Bob, "Okay, before we'll sell you the Boston paintings, because that's what they called them, for $30 million, we want you to buy these paintings for $3 million first." Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? And Bob said to them, "I don't have a buyer for these. You know, my buyers want the world's most valuable stolen artwork. They don't want like a Vlaminck. They've never even heard of these pieces." But they were adamant. So that's when it was clear to all of us that they didn't have the Gardner painting. So I transferred the operation to Miami, and shortly thereafter, the subjects were arrested outside of Marseille, France, when they sold the stolen Nice paintings to Bob. They were prosecuted. They got lengthy prison sentences. They claimed that the FBI made them do this, which couldn't have been farther from the truth. And you know, I personally, we arrested the guy down in Miami, and I went down and interviewed him, and he flat out told me it was a scam. They were just trying to figure out some way to scam Bob, our undercover, because he wanted to get a visa to remain in the country. So there's a lot of work that went into that, and at the end of the day, there was nothing to it.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the Dodge Daytona and sort of the journey that took right around the time of the heist, and I guess who owned that?
Yeah, so there were some kids walking down the street the night of the robbery. There were some teenage kids, and they were coming from a St. Patrick's Day party on Tetlow Street around the corner. And as they're walking near the museum, they see what they very accurately described as a 1985 to 1988 Dodge Daytona, which is kind of like it's kind of an esoteric vehicle. It's a little Dodge sports car hatchback. And as they got up alongside this car, they looked in, and there were two guys in the car, and they could see the driver, and he was wearing a Boston police uniform. So they've been drinking, they're underage. They decided it was probably best that they continue on their way quickly. So that was known right from the beginning, that the subjects were driving a Dodge Daytona. And it was always theorized that it probably belonged to somebody, right? I mean, at least I theorized that. I mean, if you were going to steal a car to do this robbery and you're going to be dressing as cops, I think you'd probably want to steal like a Ford LTD or a Caprice Classic or something that looks like a cop car. A little two-door red hatchback isn't the appropriate vehicle. So that vehicle was always kind of hanging out there. And in 2008, we got some very credible information that a guy by the name of George Weisfelder, who's a member of a criminal enterprise in the Dorchester section of Boston, that he was involved in the heist, and that he'd stashed the paintings up in Maine, or the paintings had been stashed in Maine. And so I got this information in 2008, and I'm like, started taking a harder look at George Weisfelder, whose name had been around. I mean, he'd always been on the suspect list, but I really started digging into him deeper. And, you know, the first thing you do when you're starting to look at a potential suspect, very first thing you do is you run their criminal history. You know, what have they been locked up for in the past? And to be honest with you, rather than, it was in the file somewhere, and that file was so massive, I was like, you know what, it'd be quicker just to run it again. So I had our ops center run it again, and I'm looking at his record, his BOP, Bureau of Prison, which is like the Massachusetts criminal history. And he'd gotten locked up for operating under the influence in the Roslindale section of Boston in November of '89. This is 4 months before the heist occurred. And it's one of these things that never works out unless it's like a TV show where you're like, can you imagine if he was driving an 85 to 88 red Dodge Daytona? That would have been too cool. But yeah, let's do it anyway. Let's roll the dice. And so there was a Boston police detective on our task force with whom I worked very closely, and I asked her to get a copy of the Boston Police Report, which is called 011. And they pulled it from the archives, the BPD archives, and faxed it over, and it's the old like blotchy microfiche. And they sent over the police report from when he was locked up, and sure enough, George Reisfelder was driving a 1988 Dodge Daytona, color red. And it was registered to him, but he'd registered it up in New Hampshire, which is why my predecessors hadn't caught it. And this was a tremendous clue. Like, this is one of those few aha moments in an investigation when you're like, the odds that this guy happens to also drive a vehicle that's identical to the vehicle that was being driven by the subjects the night of the robbery it boggles the mind. So yeah, that was a really important clue in this investigation.
So while we're talking about the car, both Randy and Rick identified it as that particular vehicle, right?
Not the guards, it was the witnesses outside.
Oh, the witnesses outside.
Yeah, teenagers.
Right. And one of them says it was gray and one of them says it was red.
Yeah.
Which made me think, was one of them maybe colorblind?
No.
Oh.
That's a great point. But that fact right there, like, opened up a whole can of worms. And it's fun to talk about, so I'll bore you with it. But that was the thing, right? These two teenagers give really impressive descriptions of this vehicle. They both said it was an 85 to 88 Dodge Daytona. And one of them was so positive about it because he said that a movie had just come out that featured a Dodge Daytona. And I did research and I found that a movie called My Blue Heaven with Steve Martin and Rick Moranis came out in 1990, and it had a 1985 Dodge Daytona in it. And ironically, right, Steve Martin is playing a mobster being hounded by Rick Moranis, who's this FBI agent. But the teenagers, so they got that part. They got the hard part, right? They got the vehicle, the make, the model, and the year range. They got that correct. They nailed it, but they differed so wildly. One was positive it was red, and the other one was positive that it was gray. That was always this vexing mystery. But once we were able to identify Reisfelder's vehicle, then it really all started to fall into place, because the vehicle was described as red in the Boston Police Report. But then I did some more digging, and it turns out that vehicle coincidentally was sold 6 days before the Gardner robbery. Reisfelder sold his car 6 days before at a used car lot out in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is, like, for those of you from Massachusetts, it's about 2 hours west. It's a long way away. But it wasn't registered until like 9 days after the Gardner heist, which is surprising, right? Because who's you buy a used car at the lot, usually the dealer will go send a runner to go get your plates for it. You register it the day you buy it. If you buy it yourself, if you buy it privately, you're probably going to go to the registry the next day to get it registered so you can drive it around. So who's going to wait 2 weeks from when they buy the car to when they finally register it in Massachusetts? To answer that question right now, I think those subjects, Reisfelder and his friend, were not expecting to be seen by those teenage witnesses outside the museum wearing police uniforms. And they realized they've got to get rid of that car. And it doesn't do any good to get rid of it the day after the heist. They've got to get rid of the car showing that he did not have ownership of it the night of the heist. And so I think they found somebody out in Springfield, a used car dealer out in the Springfield area, who would backdate a bill of sale. I think that vehicle was probably sold, in actuality, the end of March, and probably registered that day. And to get back to the color, when it was sold on the registry documents as red, just like the police report. But when it was registered at the end of March, it was described as gray. And that was always this vexing mystery until we were finally able to interview Reisfelder's sister-in-law. And she told me that Reisfelder's car, he loved that car, she said. Reisfelder's car was two-tone. It was red over silver, red over gray. And I checked with Dodge, and sure enough, in 1988, they offered the Daytona in a two-tone red over gray model. What are the odds?
So they were both right.
Exactly. They were both right. You're both right. It's red and it's red.
Wow.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's fascinating. It's these, you know, these are like the aha moments that I had throughout this investigation, that it was like, people need to hear about this because it's incredible.
Now, so in the book, you track areas where the paintings seem to have been. Donati's farmhouse, Gentile's. Two questions here. Do you know, or like, do you have a best guess on where they went from there, from, I guess, the Philadelphia area? And then that seems like that was only a few of the paintings that you wrote about as far as that trek that they went on. Do you know about like the other batch?
To put it simply, I don't. You know, we have some very credible sightings of the storm, the finial, over the years, the concert, but I'm to be completely candid, the Lady and Gentleman in Black, which is the other large Rembrandt, I've never spoken to anybody who said that they saw it subsequent to the robbery. Same thing for Landscape with an Obelisk, and the Chinese beaker. Right, these are some of the pieces that really disappeared off the face of the earth. And you know, if you buy into my theory, or the FBI's theory, that Bobby Donati was involved and that he was murdered because somebody was trying to extract information from him as to where he hid the paintings, then the question is, where did he hide them? And to that end, over the years, we probably did at least maybe close to 24 consent searches of residences and businesses that were associated with Bobby Donati, his home, family's homes, places he used to work. We even did a consent search in 2015 at the Suffolk Downs racetrack, which is this large racetrack in East Boston, because it was closed for renovations in 1990. And like, what a perfect place to hide some paintings because it's not open to the public. So, you know, I'd love to be able to tie everything up like it was, you know, an Agatha Christie novel, and be able to show everything. But there's simply some unanswered questions that are just going to have to remain, because that's just the way it is.
And this might be an unanswerable question because it's mostly an opinion. When the paintings were stolen, they were damaged a lot when they were stolen. They were cut. There's paint chips on the floor. I don't know what they did in order to get them into the car, but you know, I can imagine that they weren't treated with a lot of care, you know, after the fact. But do you think that the people who stole them, or the people who ultimately hid them, understood that they had to be in some sort of climate controlled environment? You know, that anything like, they were so delicate, any exposure to humidity would affect their resale value. Were they aware of this?
No, but listen, you know, that's a great question. So in terms of damage to the pieces, two of them were cut out of the frames, the large Rembrandts, the Storm and the Lady and Gentleman in Black. Those are the only two pieces that were cut out. And they didn't suffer that much damage, and we know that from the paucity of paint chips that were recovered on the floor of the Dutch room. I mean, if there'd been big chunks of paint that had sloughed off, that would be one thing. But there were some flecks from the damage. It was a very sharp blade, probably a box cutter using the frame as a straight edge. So they didn't really suffer too much damage as a result of that. You would hope that they would be kept with a modicum of care, but it's always important to look at two salient points when you're talking about this. Number one, these paintings, there's ideal, 68% humidity and a temperature between 65, and so there's the ideal conditions that you would want for artwork to keep it in pristine museum quality condition. But keeping in mind that these paintings were created in the 1600s, and for the first 300 years of their lives, they were up on the wall of, old manor houses and castles that didn't have central heating, and, probably, in the same room with these big fireplaces that are giving off soot. So they're more resilient than most people think. They can deal with the trauma of not being treated with prime conditions for a period of time. And then the other point is, of course, the conservation staff. They're at the museum, like all conservators at major museums. They're phenomenal at what they do, and they're able to make repairs despite how badly a painting is damaged. But if you, for example, if you took a very valuable Dutch master off the wall right now and you stuck it under your bed, or even if you put it up in your attic, and came back in 30, 40 years, it would still be intact. Yeah, it's going to be damaged, but not so damaged that it's irrevocable, that it can't be repaired.
Wow. Okay, that's great, because that goes against like this popular notion that they were like slashed out of the frames and there was like paint chips everywhere, and then they like folded them up, and there was all this damage done to them. So you've actually given me hope here.
Okay, yeah. Look, you couldn't roll them. I mean, that's one of when we would get tips saying that this painting, I saw the storm, or I saw that the Vermeer was, they unfurled it like a poster out of a poster tube. It's like, no, it's just not possible. Especially when you're talking about the large Rembrandts. They'd been relined at least twice with additional canvas glued on the back with animal glue. These things they have the consistency of like foam board. You would not be able to roll it. You would quickly realize it's not an option. And in terms of, all the paint chips that were recovered from the scene were all taken by the FBI, and, it filled a little vial of chips. It's not a tremendous amount. And most of those chips probably sloughed off from the straight edge as it was being cut out of the frame, as opposed to like coming off the face of the painting. So we're very hopeful, and when you look, it sounds horrible to say when you're talking about artwork as an investigator and you've been looking for them, or you're the public and you want to see them returned, that to these paintings, like centuries doesn't matter. If you look through history, there's art theft of major paintings that have been missing for hundreds of years. And, we just saw Salvator Mundi, that was a piece that was recovered a few years ago that had been thought lost for hundreds of years and still in decent shape that can be conserved. So they will come back. And art theft is usually pieces are recovered shortly after the theft, or it becomes generational and somebody's going to be going through an attic or something. I had a case right before I retired, the last week before I retired. I was able to repatriate to the Okinawan government these 22 artifacts which had been looted at the end of World War II, and a family member came forward in 2022 to tell me that they found these paintings in her father's house when they cleaned it out after he died. So 80 years after they were looted, we were able to get back these Okinawan treasures, and they're all intact. They need to be conserved, but they will be conserved, and they'll be back on display in Okinawa. So they'll come back. I'm confident of that.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today. This has been an incredible interview, and we really appreciate your time, and congrats on the book. And we hope all of our listeners go pick up a copy.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Lance. No, I appreciate it. It's a very personal subject for me. I really, I loved the case. I love the museum, and I'm really excited to talk about it. And hopefully we'll have some success down the road.